Futurized goes.
You have just listened to another episode of the Futurized podcast with me, Trond Arne Undheim, futurist, scholar, and author. If you are interested in my products and services, feel free to check out futurized.org/store, where you can book a keynote speech, become a sponsor or partner, request a podcast swap, or buy a few of my books, such as Augmented Lean, Health Tech, Future Tech, Pandemic Aftermath, Disruption Games, or Leadership from Below. If you're interested in any or all of my projects, check out my website, trondundheim.com, which has links to other podcasts as well as my public appearances.
And other thought leaders.
Thank you.
Or even the occasional celebrity.
Please share this show with those you care about. To find us on social media is easy. We are Futurized on LinkedIn and YouTube, and Futurized 2 on Instagram and Twitter. See you next time. Futurized, conversations that matter.
If you're new to the show, seek particular topics, or are looking for a great way to tell your friends about the show, we've got the episode categories. Those are at futurized.org/episodes. I am the co-author of Augmented Lean, a human-centric framework for managing frontline operation, and the author of Health Tech, Rebooting Society's Software, Hardware, and Mindset, Future Tech, How to Capture Value from Disruptive Industry Trends, Pandemic Aftermath, How Coronavirus Changes Global Society, The Disruption Games, How to Thrive on Serial Failure, and of Leadership from Below, How the Internet Generation Redefines the Workplace. For an overview, you can go to trondundheim.com/books. At this stage, Futurized is lucky enough to have several sponsors. And to check them out, go to futurized.org/sponsors. If you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or to get an overview of other services provided by me, including how to book me for keynote speeches, please go to futurized.org/store. We'll consider all brands that have demonstrably positive contributions to the future. Before you do anything else, make sure you are subscribed to our newsletter on futurized.org, where you can find hundreds of episodes of conversations that matter to the future. Please also leave a positive review on iTunes. Thanks so much.
Emile, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Look, Emile, you're an exciting person. You're a philosopher, a historian. You're working on the big questions, ethical implications, existential risk in the widest sense. You're a writer. You're a thinker. You've been working with a bunch of notable people and institutions. Future of Life Institute. You've been with briefly at Harvard University. Your degrees are in neuroscience from Brandeis, but you also spent time in Cambridge at the Caesar, Center for Existential Risk. You just defended your PhD thesis. Congratulations at the Leibniz Universität of Hanover. But really, you're a writer. Just very affable writer. Lots of publications, interesting stuff. And you're a musician. I was just listening to some of your older work, which is great. Repetition in Order here by Baobab, your alter ego there. Emile, tell me how this all got together, and we'll get to existential risk. We'll talk about all the controversy surrounding it, which you have just embedded yourself deeply in. Just you must enjoy controversy, but it's a whole other question. But I'm going to give it to you. Was that a fair characterization of some of the things you were up to?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, in a past life, I was a musician, and yeah, I toured for a bit, but really for the past decade and a half, my focus has been writing, in particular on existential threats to civilization and humanity. And then more recently, my book project, and the book is supposed to come out in just a few days, has focused on the history of thinking about human extinction and the history of thinking about the ethical and evaluative implications of our extinction. Because I was working in this field, for many years, and it occurred to me that nobody had really done a historical examination of the evolution of these ideas. Where did they come from? Where did this notion of existential risk arise from? What are the antecedents that led to it? So that got me really curious in that. Yeah.
Yeah, it is interesting because, and this goes to part of your critique, which, has been part of this controversy, right? Because certain circles were, I guess, understood, perhaps not for their own, by their own fault. But existential risk for a while has been kind of, people might have thought that it was located in a philosophical debate surrounding Oxford University. But in your book and in other sources, it transpires that it's a much wider concern, which is important.
Mm-hmm.
So listen, there are so many ways that we could enter into this, but let me just line up a couple of little questions, and then I'm going to just give it to you to structure and tell us a little bit, how you would characterize the situation. So we've talked a little bit about existential risk already. What is the main controversy in the debate right now? Does it have to do with technology? There are a lot of fears out there. AI, right? Big fear. Does it have to do with, notably, like philosophy and ethics and those things? Or is it a much wider set of issues that is causing these debates? And what are the key debates for you? And why is it so important? Because you are very passionate about this. And these are obviously serious questions, but like you pointed out and you've been writing about in your book, these are questions that many scholars have been asking for centuries, if not millennia. So why the relevance now?
Yeah, so for me, the main problem, so far as, I would argue the main problem with this notion of existential risk, which is pretty historically new, right? So, there were people who, throughout the 20th century, really going back to the middle of the 19th century, after the discovery of the second law of thermodynamics, there were a number of people who were worried about human extinction. And the idea of existential risk, though, is really intimately bound up with a particular normative futurology, a particular normative vision of what the future ought to look like. And this vision is transhumanism. And then also there was this totalist utilitarian component as well, from pretty early on. So I could go into detail about that. I mean, basically it's, existential risk was defined as any event that would prevent us from realizing a techno-utopian future. And
can you just, for people that may not fully understand or just even know who or what we're talking about, that particular direction, the direction of thought that you're describing now, where does it originate and who are, I guess, its most vocal representatives today?
Yeah, so transhumanism really was developed or introduced during the 20th century by some leading eugenicists. So these were individuals who belonged to the first wave of eugenics, which sort of extended all the way up until probably the 1970s or so. And Julian Huxley is a primary figure. And so the idea was, for eugenicists, the goal was to perfect the human stock, to perfect humanity, and also to prevent us from degenerating. So there were a lot of concerns, particularly in the very late 19th century, early 20th century, about human degeneration. And going back even a couple centuries before that, one of the more influential theories of how racial groups emerged was that humanity itself began as a population of white people. And then certain groups degenerated, and that's how you get non-white races.
We laugh, but these are serious matters. But we have to keep an upbeat tone about this. I just want to clarify a little bit. So,
sure,
you say that it originated in the 20th century. Does it for you reside in one particular scientific subject, or is it a bunch of people? So I could just imagine, how you write about this in your book, but certainly biologists were involved, philosophers certainly also, but also psychology was starting to really emerge as a science. And I know for a fact that there were some psychologists also that got into the debate, investigating questions of intelligence and other things. How does this fit with science and scientific thinking?
Yeah, I mean, psychology definitely played a non-trivial role in the emergence of eugenics, right? So psychologists, especially eugenicists, who helped to develop the IQ test. And then, the IQ test was utilized in many cases to essentially keep marginalized people sort of relatively powerless.
Right. I mean, there's an established line of thinking there that says, many of these early tests, at least, were culturally specific. They were asking for information that is located, in certain cultures, so that could have contributed to that. And there's
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there are people from all different, scientific backgrounds and non-scientific backgrounds as well who were part of the eugenics movement. And yeah, like I mentioned, I mean, the main goal was just to make humanity the best version of itself possible. And then transhumanism was this idea that, well, if we're going to use the methods of eugenics, of selective breeding, maybe forced sterilization, but also just encouraging so-called geniuses to have more children, to increase the frequency of their genetic traits within the human population. Why stop there? Why not try to transcend humanity entirely? So that was really the key idea with transhumanism. And initially, when it was developed by Julian Huxley, as well as others like J.B.S. Haldane and J.D. Bernal, the method was going to be something related to eugenics. And then it was really with the 1970s, with the emergence of this brand new field of scientific inquiry called genetic engineering, as well as these sort of anticipations that genetic engineering could ultimately become extremely powerful. And there were sort of hints that maybe there's some even more sophisticated kind of methods. We would call them synthetic biology now, or biotechnology or something. So even more sophisticated methods that could enable us to radically modify ourselves. Either changing just these cells in our bodies, or perhaps the germline, in which case the modifications would be passed down to all future generations. And so the transhumanist vision of transcending humanity, when that was combined with this second wave of eugenics, focus on these new methodologies that are emerging, associated with genetic engineering and so on.
But Emile,
that's where you really get the... Yeah.
I'm still struggling with the connection between what you're talking about now and the study and worry about existential risk. Because, up until now, it sounds like by today's standards, for most people, a misguided line of thinking that devalues humanity, as I see it, as a whole, and prioritizes certain groups. But the overall study of existential risk, are you saying that the main thrust, or one of the main thrusts of this field, originated among thinkers who were heavily influenced by this tradition? Is that kind of your main critique of this, the contemporary situation?
That's definitely part of it. Yeah. So it was transhumanists who introduced this notion of existential risk. And the original way that it was defined in 2002 by Nick Bostrom, who's probably the most prominent transhumanist of the 21st century so far, along with Ray Kurzweil, I would say. So he was a transhumanist. He introduced this notion of existential risk as basically any event that's going to prevent us from creating this post-human utopian future in which we radically enhance ourselves to become immortal, to we plug our brains into computers via brain-computer interfaces. Maybe we completely upload our minds to computer hardware, and then we immediately attain some kind of digital immortality, and we can radically enhance our cognitive systems, the algorithm, so-called, running on the wetware of our brains. And so ultimately, this, in the process, we can abolish suffering. We can use, advanced technologies to introduce radical abundance. So we end up in this post-scarcity world. So there was this utopian vision at the very heart of the notion of existential risk. And then it was augmented further in 2003. So 1 year after Bostrom introduced the concept of existential risk, in 2003, he published this other paper that combined this transhumanist vision with a utilitarian perspective on the ethical aspects of the long-term future of humanity. And
Can we briefly just cover
Sure.
utilitarian methodology and thinking? Because, for many people this is obvious, but just for others, what is for you the key of utilitarianism as it is, manifested in this particular situation?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, utilitarianism has a number of different interpretations. The most relevant version of this ethical theory is totalist utilitarianism. So this combines a claim about what makes the universe good with this kind of precept about what we ought to do. And what we ought to do is whatever makes the universe good. What makes the universe good? Well, the more total value it contains. So, a different version, just to put this in contrast, a different version of utilitarianism would say, our aim is to maximize the total amount of values, let's say happiness, the total amount of happiness within the population of individuals who currently exist.
And that's what I think most people learn in philosophy class, or the notion that even people who have studied a little bit of philosophy or went through like a year of philosophy at university, or even just took a high school course, or were reading the original thinkers, I think that's their common sense notion of what it means. But you're saying these 20th century thinkers actually took it much further into the far future. How does that even start as an idea? And we have to talk about the far future. It's like it's such a fascinating and I guess utopian concept, right? Because we're departing a little bit from science here, my assertion, and we're moving into visionary ideas, political projects. Certainly a lack of true evidence, but nonetheless fascinating. What is this new domain that Bostrom and others are painting for us?
Yeah, sure. So I think there are two key ideas. So one has to do with this totalist aspect, this totalist interpretation of utilitarianism. It's not just about maximizing the amount of happiness that exists among the actual people, among the people who currently exist. It's about increasing the total amount of value in the universe as a whole. And so one way to do this is to make everybody who currently exists happier. Another way is to create new happy people. Right? So if you just increase the human population, then you'll increase the total amount of value that exists in the universe as a whole, assuming that on average, these new people who come into existence have a net positive amount of value. So even if they just have, a total of 1 unit of happiness, if you create, 100 trillion of them, then you've got 100 trillion units of happiness. And that makes
this is important. This is an important distinction, though, because it seems to me, and because I've read some of these things too, that the main thrust of these thinkers is that they very, very soon start to obsess over the perfect human, because obviously, the contribution of those individuals towards, I guess, creating even more civilizations, even further astray in galaxies far away, and here we enter into kind of the interesting domain of sci-fi. That just seems to be an obsession, even though, like you truly pointed out, just keeping people alive that are worth more than 1 on the happiness scale, which is just more than a little bit happier than the rest, is in itself valuable. Mm-hmm. But in some of your writings, you point out that this thinking very rapidly, may I use the word, degenerates into this idea that the people who exist now are somehow not very valuable in the total picture. How does that idea get started, and what's wrong with it from your point of view? Because that seems very clear from your writings. You have a very, very strong position on this.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that brings me to the second key point, which is that totalist utilitarians in the past didn't have a particularly robust view of the bigness of the future, right? So there was just this kind of a default myopia to how they were, sort of thinking about it. So this goes back to like Henry Sidgwick in the latter 19th century, and then it was really in the 1980s that people started to think, wow, the future could be enormous. And if what matters is that we increase the total amount of value in the universe, not just right now, synchronically, but diachronically across this temporal dimension. So as many, one way to maximize value is to increase the total number of people who exist right now. Another way is just to ensure that there are many, many generations in the future. Because then when you take this sideways view and you look at the timeline of cosmic history, if there are many, many generations, then that means there's going to be more total value in the universe. And so the reason this idea emerged it became clear to philosophers who were sympathetic with totalist utilitarianism in the 1980s is that the 1970s is when this new field of scientific investigation called physical eschatology was born. And that's just the study of the evolution of the universe.
Just that.
Yeah, just that. And so, including our solar system. So how long is Earth going to remain habitable? About another billion years. If we spread beyond Earth...
And that's not enough.
Well, so just that alone is sufficient for a totalist utilitarian to say, wow, there could be an enormous number of people in the future. So the very first person to ever calculate how many people might exist in the future, so far as I know, was Carl Sagan, the cosmologist. Yep. In 1983, he suggested that if we survive for another 10 million years, and the human population remains stable and people live for, let's say, 100 years, there could be 500 trillion people in the future. To put that in contrast, there are 8 billion people right now, and there's an estimated 117 billion people who have existed so far. So the future is way bigger than the past and way, way bigger than the present.
Before we keep talking about the future, I just want you to comment a little bit on how conservative thinkers view this idea, because Edmund Burke and the founding fathers of sort of the conservative movement, arguably they look back and they say the reason we have value is that we understand and further some of the values that were valuable in the past, and that change is only good if it can be interpreted as good with the whole history in mind. Mm-hmm. So it strikes me that this is a radically different way of thinking. This utopianism that you have described now is radically different from the idea that humanity is actually much more about the past and safeguarding those values. What you have described now is this enormously futuristic movement where value purely really resides in the future.
Yeah, I think the
or am I wrong about this? I mean, you've been in these circles, you've talked to these people, you've worked with Ray Kurzweil, and I'm sure you've met Bostrom and others. Are they really that extreme that they're really not very concerned about the past?
So I think the way that this notion of existential risk and this particular ethic, or I would say ideology of long-termism, was initially formulated, I think the focus really was on the future. Mm-hmm. It was, transhumanism is a future-oriented perspective. The kind of totalist, the emphasis of the totalist utilitarianism that these people embraced, or at least argued for in some published papers, is very future-oriented. And more recently, I think some of the long-termists have started to incorporate these alternative views to help further buttress their view, to say, well, you don't really need to be a totalist utilitarianism or someone who's obsessed with the vastitude of our cosmic future. Actually, you can just be more concerned with this notion that we have a sort of a curatorial duty to pass on the inheritance from past generations to the next generation. And there's a kind of moral duty to this, ensuring that we are not the link in the chain that breaks.
So is that where the existential risk part comes in? That the concern here becomes, could something break this chain? Could we go extinct? And if so, whatever the extinct means, but we haven't talked about that so much, but in the Bostrom vernacular, it's some sort of catastrophic event that, if it doesn't even fully destroy all living humans, it at least puts us on a negative trajectory where we risk losing a majority of our people and potential, and perhaps forever are sort of decimated in this from this departure that we should proliferate into the trillions and trillions.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I mean, Edmund Burke himself was focused on. I mean, he introduced this notion that of the partnership of the generations. Society is a partnership of between the current generations, past generations looking behind us, and then future generations looking in front of us. And his real focus was on society. And for us to catastrophically terminate or destroy this partnership, and in doing so, lose the inheritance that has been bequeathed to us from past generations. We don't need to go extinct. There could just be some violent revolution like the French Revolution that destroys our society.
But Emile, surely that is kind of every mainstream thinker, or indeed every common person, will generally have the idea that it's a good thing that humanity exists, or am I wrong? So this is not really original per se. It is the consequences of this thinking when you draw it into the extreme that becomes concerning, or am I wrong? Is the foundation of this thinking that humanity exists and should continue to exist? Are you even questioning that notion?
So interestingly, it was the case that with respect to the history of thinking about questions like should humanity continue to exist, these were first addressed, I think, really for the first time systematically in the second half of the 19th century. And I mentioned Henry Sidgwick. He's one individual who explicitly addressed these questions, but pretty much at the exact same time, in the 1870s, there was a flurry of thinkers based in Germany, where I am, who held a diametrically opposed view. And they argued that being extinct would be better than continuing to exist. So and this tradition of, I call this view pro-extinctionism. This tradition of pro-extinctionism has maintained a fairly consistent number of notable people who have been advocates for it. Throughout the 20th century, there were a number of philosophical pessimists who held the exact same view that being extinct would be better. And all the way up to the present. David Benatar is one of the more notable figures. He himself holds some very questionable views on all sorts of other things as well. But he's a pro-extinctionist and thinks that actually the Bostrom and the other long-termists are completely wrong, and the better thing would be for us to cease to exist.
Something that strikes me here, thinking about these things, when you talk about them this way, is that mitigation of risks becomes actually really controversial, which is somewhat surprising to the plain politician who might look at these things and say, well, day to day, what are we going to do about this? Or enterprise risk people who are thinking, does this pose a risk to my great and thriving business in the short term, or even, in the term of my employment, or, is it going to affect me as a chief risk officer, or, are we resilient? But what we're talking about here now suddenly is not mitigating certain risks that everyone agrees about. Suddenly everything's up for grabs. Should we even exist? If we want to further that existence, it doesn't seem very clear to me exactly what one might want to do here to mitigate for something utopias that we perhaps don't even agree about. Because so far it seems you sort of said they want to further happiness, but that is a very abstract notion. And so tell me then how these long-termists view mitigation. What is mitigation to them?
Yeah, so, great questions. Maybe one thing that's useful to start with is to tie together some loose ends of some of the really interesting issues that you've brought up for the long-termists, because given the insights of contemporary physical eschatology about how long we could exist into the future, about how large the universe is, and consequently how many future people there could be, especially if we become digital beings in the future, they're going to argue that mitigating existential risk is extremely important. So there is a discontinuity in the badness of a catastrophe that kills everybody on Earth. So you could imagine that, imagine some disaster like a global pandemic or a thermonuclear conflict. So as the number of casualties, as the number of deaths increase, the badness of the situation increases, let's just say, in proportion, in a linear fashion. Once you get to 100% of humanity dying off, though, then the badness of the situation completely skyrockets. Because it's at that point that you foreclose permanently the realization of all future value, which again could be absolutely enormous. There could be 10 to the 58, a 1 followed by 58 zeros, digital beings that exist in the future. If they are on average happy, that's an enormous amount of value in the future that we'd lose. So the badness increases as you get to 50% of humanity dying off, 99% of humanity dying off, continues to increase, and then 100%, the badness is just orders of magnitude worse. So it's qualitatively different. And so this means that mitigating existential risk is really, really important. It takes precedent, or at least it should, from a moral perspective, take precedent over all other catastrophes that do not threaten our extinction. This would include maybe climate change if it's not going to threaten the.
Yeah, what is this thing that one hears that climate change is not an existential risk? Is that just like an Earth-centric view? And what's Earth anyway in a cosmic age? Basically, it's our vessel now. It's sort of our container for now, but we will vastly, expand beyond this sad state of territorial confinement into the beauty of open space. And so space policy here and space expansion and technology would seem becomes really, really important.
Yeah. I mean, space expansionists would refer to Earth as the cradle of humanity. So this is where we're born. We sort of grew up, but once we matured to beyond our adolescence, which maybe we're right now in our reckless adolescence where we're taking foolish risks and so on. But once we mature beyond that, we'll eventually spread into space. As soon as we spread into space, the probability of some kind of catastrophe, an existential catastrophe that would erase all of that future value before we've had a chance to draw it, will be greatly reduced. So, yeah, I mean, but with respect to climate change, I think the idea is that if you look at the scientific literature, it's true that most climatologists don't think that climate change is going to cause our extinction. Some people are going to persist. It's going to be the wealthy people, who are most likely to be able to pull through if climate change becomes really catastrophic, which it seems like it's going to be. The global south is going to suffer, tremendously. But ultimately, the effects of all the carbon dioxide that we're pumping into the atmosphere right now will persist for roughly 10,000 years. So that's a longer period of time than civilization has existed so far. Civilization's been around for like 6,000 years or so. So it's going to be really, really bad, but it's not going to cause our extinction. And when you zoom out and you take a genuinely cosmic view, the 10,000 years is just almost nothing compared to the 10 to the 40 years that we could exist into the future. Maybe we could actually exist much further than that, 10 to the 100 years. So these are actual estimates. 10 to the 40 years is when protons are expected to decay. If they decay, we don't know. 10 to the 100 years, that's when the heat death of the universe occurs. When the universe as a whole sinks into this frozen state of thermodynamic equilibrium, and information processing becomes, depending on which cosmologist you ask, it becomes completely impossible. So that's
Emile, I'm just curious, what is your preferred time frame? Because you're sort of a little ironically characterizing the gazillions of years of perspective from a cosmologist or a long-termist of that of that ilk. The U.S. sort of original population here, I talked about the 7-generation principle. There's a declaration. There are people now, wanting to resurrect the tradition of thinking beyond one generation and thinking more in terms of 5 to 7 generations. Meanwhile, real politics as of now is concerned with a budget year, perhaps with a 4-year elected term, and in some parliaments with an 8-year elected term.
Mm-hmm.
How do you reconcile all that? The fact that most decisions are taken with less than a year, or stock market, or like TikTok instantaneousness in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's this ambition to go back to Aboriginal principles, basically, of earthly cycles, and who is sort of the oldest elder that you'd be expected to preserve, and your children's children's children, who so that's one frame of mind. But then these 10 to the 58 years is a very, very different story, and I'm sure there's a lot in between there. What is an appropriate time frame to consider existential risk?
Yeah, it's a great question. One thing to say is you're totally right that short-termism, myopia, is built into a lot of our institutions, right? Quarterly reports, and like you said, 4-year, 6-year, maybe 8-year election cycles. All of that's really near term. And this kind of myopia is profoundly dangerous because some of the alterations we're making to Earth will last for an extremely long amount of time. Some of them will be permanent. So, for example, there's some biologists and ecologists who have argued that our greatest legacy from this century is biodiversity loss. And, ultimately, if, let's say we survive for another, 10,000 years or so, and then we die out, and there's an alien civilization that arrives on Earth, and they've got their own geologists, and they start to dig through the stratigraphic record, they're going to notice that there was some kind of, major mass extinction event in the 21st century. They're also going to notice that there's this really thin layer of artificial radionuclides, which we would date to the 1950s when there were all these, thermonuclear tests all around the planet. But they're going to notice that biodiversity loss is significantly decreased, and a lot of the species we're losing, virtually all the species we lose are gone forever. And the only reason I say virtually all is maybe we can, maybe there are resurrection biologists. That's an actual field. We'll be able to bring some of them back to life.
To your point with synthetic biology, species by species, or perhaps in some automated fashion, one could use AI and other methods to start to regenerate species at scale. However, this brings me to just to add to this question that I feel like you're still answering. Mm-hmm. Democracy is actually part of the problem here, isn't it? Because democracy in itself was built around these institutions that you speak about, and this notion of creating laws that are where we do care about just the generation that is basically over 18, and until they could care less about voting, which I don't know at what point that is, and that obviously is extending because people are living longer. But that is a fairly myopic view on decision making, mm-hmm. given that there is, if you think 7 generations, how are you going to make all those vote in some sense? Jefferson talked about, we need a new constitution every generation, but what's a generation, and who gets to vote and when? Mm-hmm. And then just to add to the complexity, these long-termists, what do they think about legitimate voting rights, and who gets to decide all these things? Because at the heart of it, it's not just philosophy and ethics; it's who gets to click on the voting button. If we even believe that voting is interesting in this respect, what are your thoughts on that? The political reality of X risk.
Yeah, so I agree that democracy is not ideal when it comes to planning for the further future. That said, I'm not willing to compromise on democracy. I mean, it is an absolutely terrible form of government.
Yeah, but
the
to be
best
clear,
that we
I'm not
have.
saying democracy is horrible. I'm saying there seems to be a natural consequence of all of this long-termist, but even this seven-generation thinking that democracy is very myopic.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I don't have a good solution to this problem. I know there have been, I mean, this is a topic that scholars have been discussing, and I haven't really kept up with the literature on it. But I mean,
Could you conceivably preserve votes of past and dead people and fix certain votes that you say we're going to vote now and then we're going to vote in 100 years and we're going to take the average of the votes over 30, 50, 100, give it 1,000 years, and then at some point we're going to have to, if pushed, we'll make a decision, but not based on current politicians or people with over 18. We're going to make an intergenerational vote. Have these ideas been explored? I'm just curious, do you know of any such thing?
I'm not really sure, to be honest. But I mean, what strikes me is what you really want is future generations having the opportunity to vote, right? Not just like the past generations.
No, I'm actually saying I'd be really curious to hear what someone in the 17th century would vote on something that's easily enough understood. Like, here's humanity. Here's the situation right now. Like, if you could beam yourself back to the 17th century, wouldn't you be interested in what a intellectual person or even any person thought about what's going on now? Well, what literally would they say? Yes, no, don't know, to any given issue of the day?
Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, surely it would be very interesting to know. I'm not sure people, from a couple centuries ago would have any good insight about what ought to be the case. I mean, in fact, I think this is part of the problem with the long-termist view is that I mean, there's a lot to say about this because some of them have addressed this issue, but our capacity to anticipate what the future will look like, what values future generations will have, what they're going to want out of their own future is it may be as completely unpredictable to us and alien as, if you go back and you talk to somebody from the Enlightenment and, you ask them certain questions about, the way our society is structured with respect to, let's say, men and women, right? Like in the past, there were very sexist societies, and so they might look at us and go like, "Wow, it's just a complete, a completely different paradigm of ethical values and societal mores." That so yeah, it would be interesting, but I certainly wouldn't want them to be able to dictate what the present looks like. And in that same respect, I would worry about us dictating what the future might look like too much. So I think keeping options open, which is something that long-termists discuss. That is an idea that I think is really important because it provides future generations the latitude to determine for themselves what they want the world to look like, what they want their own future to be, without us imposing our own values on them.
Emile, let me ask you one last sort of big question. If you put your own futurist hat on, what are some trajectories, some scenarios that you think seem plausible in terms of the next decade, the next century? I don't know, pick your time frame that you care about, that you think it's possible to reason about given your knowledge, our knowledge, the knowledge base essentially. Or perhaps just based on visionary ideas. I don't know. I'm just curious. What is sort of, when you look at your reality and the data and everything that you looked in the past, you obviously living in the present like all of us, and you're looking at these long-termists and you're criticizing some of their perspectives. If I want to challenge you on this, what would your future predictions be?
So I think consistent with what I was trying to argue, um, a little bit, could have articulated the idea a bit better, but I really don't know. I think the climate science is quite robust, and consequently, we should expect with a high degree of certainty the future to be pretty devastating in many ways. The global south in particular is going to be very hard hit by climate change. Sea levels are going to rise. Cities like Miami are going to, kind of disappear, as well as island nations like the Maldives and, the various others. They'll disappear. And then you've got all of the various consequences of political instability, social upheaval, mass migrations. More than 1 billion people are predicted to be displaced. I believe by the end of the century. I believe that's the timeline. So I think it is entirely possible that there's some very clever young person, maybe already born, who will devise some technology that is very efficient, energy efficient, that can be used at scale, and can extract carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to reverse all of the harm that we've caused, to reverse this trend of increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations over the past couple of centuries. And as a result, it may be the case that the worst predictions of climate change, including entering a future state that some climate scientists have called the hothouse Earth state, which is just going to be very hard to live in. It's going to be very unpleasant. And even if you're in the global north and you're wealthy, it's still going to be psychologically devastating because you're going to have to be reading these headlines every day about more millions of people being displaced, millions of people dying, awful deaths as a result of extreme weather and so on. So it's entirely possible that all of that may be avoided. But we shouldn't count on that. Maybe this technology will be invented, but maybe it won't. And so I think one thing I feel fairly certain about is that the future is just going to be chaotic, and our world is going to unravel in ways that are completely unprecedented in all of human civilization so far. That I feel very confident about. In terms of technological
that makes you... Well, exactly. That was what I was going to ask you about, because the Techno-Modernist Manifesto, this document that some people came up with a few years ago, right? It sort of says innovation will solve it all. And if you look at sort of the economist answer to all of this, is also generally, value will be created, and what we call problems now, 50 years from now, the economy will be so huge that we'll just throw some money at it, and some clever university research team will come up with that technology you were just talking about. You seem to sort of leave that door open, but you're saying it's wrong to gamble on it. What does that lead to? Does that lead us in degrowth, or does it lead into further expansion, but without the certainty of the techno-modernist?
I think degrowth is the surest way to avert the worst possible aspects.
Why? Because it gives us more time?
So I would say I'm not super familiar with the degrowth literature. I mean, I know there's a huge, already huge and burgeoning sort of literature, people writing about this issue, and I just haven't had time with all the other stuff I've been working on to really become deeply conversant with it. But my kind of sophomoric understanding is that, degrowth is just a sure way to, we need to stop using fossil fuels. This notion that economic growth is the solution is just really potentially dangerous. And yeah, again, from an eco-modernist, with respect to the eco-modernist claim, it could very well be the case that these technologies save us. But also, if you look historically, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, a lot of people were super worried about overpopulation. And there were predictions that in the 1970s and 1980s, there'd be, tens of millions of people who would perish as a result of famine. So this was the revival of Malthusianism, so neo-Malthusianism. And claim is just, the human population is growing at something like a geometrical rate. Food sources are growing at arithmetical rate, and consequently you have this divergence, and that's going to result in catastrophe. What saved us was the Green Revolution, right? It was just these new technologies that enabled us to increase crop yield. But, so on the one hand, yes, we avoided a Malthusian catastrophe. But on the other hand, the Green Revolution has, in many ways, exacerbated the environmental predicament.
And also the invention or the use of fertilizer, right? And other things that just drastically increased agricultural production, which is tied to the Industrial Revolution, actually, or the agro part, the agricultural part of it. So, but if the techno-modernist manifesto is too optimistic, is also the techno-utopian manifesto, or whatever the long-termists, would call it, is that also necessarily then wrong-headed, or could there be still a formulation of utopia that you might want to believe in, or that people should potentially believe in? Is the approach of looking for utopia the wrong approach?
I think so. In general, utopian visions, I think, are dangerous. So this brings us kind of full circle with some of the issues we were talking about before. On the long-termist, or I would say the TESCRealist, the T stands for transhumanism, the L at the end stands for long-termism. It's just this bundle of ideologies that where transhumanism is really the backbone, and long-termism is, I've described as the galaxy brain atop that sort of binds together all sorts of themes, major themes of all these different ideologies. So the utopian vision, according to the TESCReal bundle of ideologies, it imagines this future in which we become posthumans, radically enhanced posthumans, who are ultimately able to live indefinitely long lifespans. Also, there's the space expansionist component. So we spread into the cosmos and we create astronomical amounts of value by bringing into existence this 10 to the 58 digital people in the future. And so there are two aspects of utopianism that I think are dangerous. One is that if you're talking about utopia, what is off the table when it comes to ensuring that this utopian world comes into existence? So if the ends sometimes justify the means, and the ends are a literal utopia with astronomical amounts of value, immortality, and so on, then what exactly is off limits for realizing this future? And so if you look throughout history, there have been all sorts of utopian movements that became violent, because basically there was somebody who was standing in the way, standing in between the movement and utopia.
Well, exactly, because the ends start to justify the means here. Because what I'm reading as a subtext in some of this is that it's not just that these utopias are about creating maximum value, but there is an implicit assumption that certain people, the smarter people, are capable of appreciating happiness deeper, and thus should be allowed to explore this interest. Like today, they might be interested in classic cars or wine or whatnot, but in the future they will have these enormously deep hobbies, and they will be the poets of the future and musicians and whatnot. And for that reason, we cannot kill off the potential to have 100 million Mozarts walking around. And that would be of enormous value, and it would create all these, like there's a subtext here that we need to grow a stock of people that become Mozarts in every domain. And if we cannot do that, and anyone that stops that process is a Luddite, or is a morally repugnant person, because happiness cannot now be maximized.
Yeah, I would say that there is a strain of elitism and classism throughout the TESCReal bundle. You find it in the writings of Nick Bostrom, for example, who was a co-founder of the long-termist ideology, and again, an early transhumanist, a very prominent transhumanist. And so, one example is a paper he titled "Why I Want to Become Posthuman When I Grow Up." He imagines what it would be like to become posthuman. And the way he describes is in the early stages of becoming a post-human being, you start to find that rather than enjoying things like hanging out at the bar, watching sports with your friends, drinking beer, instead you pick up the saxophone and you start to learn some jazz. And maybe then you find reading philosophy to be more fulfilling than just
it's funny
hanging
when
out
you
with your
describe this.
buddies.
I've read that article too, and it strikes me that, I do all these things now, and I'm not particularly bright or enlightened, or I'm not, I don't know. This can be done already. What
And
is this
also,
assumption that we need 100,000 years to evolve into the state of enjoying the saxophone or guitar, in my case?
well, there's an underlying assumption that jazz is more sophisticated than sports. That reading philosophy and contemplating the perennial questions of the philosophical tradition is more is of higher value than just hanging out with your buddies and drinking beer.
I mean,
And that assumption itself.
we're coming up on the hour. I just want to draw it full circle with you, and I want to challenge you, because you were drawn to all these ideas yourself. You have worked with some of these people, and even if we today, it manifests in Bostrom, and perhaps in Ray Kurzweil. These are people with whom you have had great affinity in the past. What do you think drew you to them? And going forward, do you not understand how young people, particularly, are drawn to such ideas? Realizing that you were once someone who was drawn, it's fascinating. There are thinkers, they have these ideas, you get in their universe, and you certainly have a framework to understand some things that you've been jostling with.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, though, even if it's wrong or part wrong.
I completely agree. And I would say that I can completely understand why young people would be enamored or at least intrigued by this particular futurological vision. Because as you note, I myself was once a young person who also found this vision.
I'm not saying you're not young. I was just pointing out that we have both of us been younger. Yeah.
And I did find it appealing. And I think part of it, the appeal was that I had lost my faith in traditional religion. And transhumanism, really from the start, was designed to be a secular replacement for Christianity. So it checks a lot of the same boxes. There's a promise of immortality. There's a sense of meaning and purpose. Because if you're a transhumanist, you're working for this project. You're trying to contribute to this project, which is much greater than yourself.
So it is a religion, then, in your view?
I think it is very similar to a religion, and I would just want to add that it's facile to describe something as religion and then dismiss it. Right? This happens all the time. Oh, communism is religion, conservatism is religion.
I meant it
wokeism.
in more of a structural sense, as kind of a social science sociologist's description of a social movement that has, right, not all social movements are religious, but many are at the core, or at least have elements. And you're saying transhumanism has a fairly strong element of communitaristic values, but also, like you said, it fits other boxes in terms of rituals and answers to the future of life, and individual choice and trajectories that one should follow, and a lot of things.
Exactly, yeah. In a deeper sense, I think it's very, very similar to religion. It even has its own version of resurrection, right? So if you and I don't live long enough to live forever, as Ray Kurzweil says, then we could sign up with a company called Alcor, based in California, to have our bodies cryogenized, so that when the technology is developed at some point in the future to unfreeze our bodies, resurrect us, or maybe not to be
sort of weird or anything, but if you only could freeze one body part for economic reasons, which ones would you freeze? Your brain?
I mean, I guess brain.
Your hand?
But
I'm not going to go further down the body. But, what is the essence of, like, let's just say you cannot freeze all of, like, what do you think? Where is the essence? What would you want to wake up to, 100 years from now and have resurrected?
I mean, Alcor provides the option
freeze your soul.
Of just the neck and head as well. But I think that's just misunderstands the embodiment of intelligence. We're not just a central nervous system. We're a whole peripheral nervous system. So if you get rid of the body, then I'm not even sure if it would be possible to scan that brain, simulate it or emulate it on a computer, and then bring that person back to existence if you're not scanning the entire body.
Right. So anyways, most people are pretty tactile, right? So if you think that your body has anything to do with your happiness, then it would seem to be the wrong move to just freeze your head.
Even more, I just think that's it's almost the same as just freezing a tiny part, a tiny section of your neocortex, and then expecting to get the whole person out of that. You really need the entire nervous system, which includes the central nervous system, your brain stem, your brain that's in between your ears, but also your peripheral nervous system, all of the nerves that extend throughout your body. You probably also need, most cells in our body are microbes, and this microbiome also has a part to play in the broad internal milieu, as some biologists have called it, the internal environment of our bodies. So without all of that, it's not clear that you would get any of the individual. So this notion of just scanning the head and the neck seems fundamentally problematic to me. If it's even the case that freezing an entire body and then scanning that entire body could bring the person back into existence in the first place, which I'm very skeptical about.
These are massive questions. I'm going to ask you this. Is there any chance we could continue this? Because I think an hour is probably enough for now. But there are so many things I want to ask you and further explore. This was a great start. And thank you for coming on.
Yeah, this is absolutely fantastic. And really, we've only scratched the surface because there's so many fascinating, complicated, interesting topics to discuss. But I really enjoyed this conversation. So thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
You have just listened to another episode of the Futurized podcast with me, Trond Arne Undheim, futurist, scholar, and author. If you are interested in my products or services, feel free to check out futurized.org/store, where you can book a keynote speech, become a sponsor or partner, request a podcast swap, or buy a few of my books, such as Augmented Lean, Health Tech, Future Tech, Pandemic Aftermath, Disruption Games, or Leadership from Below. If you're interested in any or all of my projects, check out my website, trondundheim.com, which has links to other podcasts as well as my public appearances. Thank you. Please share this show with those you care about. To find us on social media is easy. We are Futurized on LinkedIn and YouTube, and Futurized 2 on Instagram and Twitter. See you next time. Futurized, conversations that matter.